You are sitting in a room where everyone seems completely certain. The conversation moves effortlessly from one confident answer to another, and for a moment you almost feel relieved. Certainty is comforting. It quiets the noise that has been following you for years. Then, without warning, a single thought appears in the back of your mind. Not because someone planted it there, not because you wanted to challenge anyone, but because your own experience refuses to stay silent. If truth is never afraid of questions, why do some questions make every conversation suddenly uncomfortable? That moment is strangely familiar to almost everyone, whether they are deeply religious, completely skeptical, or somewhere in between. It is the instant when belonging and honesty seem to pull in opposite directions. You begin wondering whether the greatest fear is not discovering the wrong answer, but asking the question that changes how everyone sees you. Maybe that is why so many people spend years protecting certainty instead of examining it. The question itself becomes less frightening than the consequences of asking it aloud. You may have experienced this without even realizing it. Perhaps it happened during a family dinner, inside a place of worship, in a classroom, or while lying awake at night when every carefully rehearsed answer suddenly felt incomplete. The most uncomfortable questions often arrive when nobody else is around. They appear in silence. They wait patiently. They refuse to disappear simply because they make us uncomfortable. This is not unique to Christianity. It is part of being human. Every worldview, every philosophy, every ideology eventually encounters questions that expose its deepest assumptions. The interesting part is not whether those questions exist. The interesting part is how people respond when they do. Some lean into uncertainty, others avoid it. Many convince themselves they have already solved it, because uncertainty feels like standing on the edge of a cliff without knowing what comes next. If this tension has ever felt familiar to you, whether you found peace with it or are still wrestling with it, share your perspective below. The most revealing conversations are often the ones where people can admit uncertainty without feeling that they have lost themselves. That sounds simple, but it rarely is. Human beings build identities around stories. Those stories explain who we are, why suffering exists, what love means, what justice demands, and what happens when life ends. Once those stories become intertwined with family, friendships, culture, and personal identity, questioning any part of them can feel less like examining an idea and more like risking the collapse of an entire life. This psychological reality explains something profound. People are rarely afraid of questions because the questions are dangerous. They are afraid because honest answers sometimes carry emotional costs. Imagine someone who has spent decades finding comfort in a particular understanding of reality. That understanding has carried them through grief, loneliness, disappointment, and loss. Now imagine introducing a question that does not attack their belief, but simply asks them to examine one of its assumptions more carefully. Even if that question is sincere, the emotional reaction may have very little to do with logic. It may have everything to do with fear, hope, identity, and belonging. The same pattern appears outside religion as well. Political beliefs, scientific paradigms, cultural traditions, personal relationships, even the stories people tell about themselves, often resist uncomfortable examination. We all protect parts of our identity. The mind is remarkably skilled at defending what feels essential for emotional survival. That realization shifts the conversation away from proving someone right or wrong, and toward understanding why certain questions feel heavier than others. Perhaps the question people seem to avoid is not a single sentence at all. Perhaps it is whatever question threatens certainty before a person feels emotionally prepared to live without it. That possibility changes everything. Suddenly, the discussion becomes less about exposing weakness and more about understanding courage. Real courage is not pretending to have no doubts. It is being willing to examine them without assuming that examination itself is failure. Many people quietly carry questions they have never voiced because they fear disappointing parents, partners, friends, or communities they deeply love. Others worry that asking difficult questions somehow betrays the faith or values that shaped them. Still others fear the opposite, that exploring belief honestly might lead them somewhere unexpected. These fears reveal something profoundly human. We do not simply seek truth. We seek security, connection, meaning, and acceptance at the same time. Sometimes those goals cooperate beautifully. Sometimes they collide. When they collide, almost everyone experiences internal conflict. That conflict deserves compassion rather than ridicule, because it reflects the complexity of being human. Before exploring any specific question, it is worth asking another one that may be even more revealing. What would happen inside you if the answer challenged something you have always believed? Would curiosity survive? Would fear take over? Would you become defensive? Or would you discover that your identity is stronger than your certainty? Those reactions often reveal more about us than the original question ever could. That is why this conversation is not really about winning arguments. It is about understanding ourselves. Somewhere ahead lies a deeper realization that has less to do with religion itself and more to do with why human beings, across cultures and throughout history, so often struggle to sit comfortably with uncertainty. And that realization begins with recognizing that the hardest questions are rarely about God alone. They are often about us. The more you examine this pattern, the harder it becomes to believe that uncertainty is simply an obstacle to be eliminated. It begins to look more like an unavoidable part of being conscious. Think about how many of life's most important decisions are made without absolute certainty. You choose relationships without knowing exactly how they will end. You pursue careers without guarantees. You trust people who might disappoint you. You forgive without proof that the pain will never return. In almost every meaningful area of life, certainty arrives far less often than we would like, yet we continue living anyway. That raises a fascinating possibility. Perhaps the deepest struggle is not whether uncertainty exists, but whether we can tolerate living with it. This is where many difficult conversations quietly change direction. What initially appears to be a debate about theology, philosophy, or evidence often becomes something much more personal. It becomes a conversation about fear. Fear of losing meaning, fear of being wrong, fear of disappointing those we love, fear of standing alone after belonging somewhere for years. These fears do not belong to one religion or one worldview. They belong to human beings. History repeatedly shows that communities built around shared convictions, whether religious, political, scientific, or cultural, naturally develop narratives that help preserve stability. Stability is not inherently negative. It allows families to function, societies to cooperate, and individuals to build identities. But stability can also make difficult questions feel disruptive, even when they are asked sincerely. The result is a subtle psychological tension. People often assume they are defending ideas, when in reality they may be defending relationships, memories, traditions, or a version of themselves they are afraid to lose. Imagine someone remembering childhood evenings surrounded by family, where stories about faith were intertwined with love, celebration, and safety. Years later, an uncomfortable question emerges. The question itself may be entirely intellectual, but answering it feels emotional, because it seems connected to every memory that gave life structure. Rejecting an idea may feel like rejecting the people who first shared it. Accepting an unfamiliar perspective may feel like betraying one's past. The emotional weight does not come from logic alone. It comes from the meaning attached to it. That is why conversations about belief often become so much more intense than conversations about ordinary facts. Rarely are people arguing only about propositions. More often, they are protecting identities shaped over decades. If you have ever found yourself caught between honesty and belonging, write about that experience below. Not to convince anyone else, but because many people quietly carry the same tension without realizing they are not alone. Reading another person's story can sometimes make our own feel a little less isolating. There is another layer to this that is even more uncomfortable. We often imagine that if we possessed enough evidence, every sincere person would reach exactly the same conclusion. Yet everyday life constantly challenges that assumption. Two thoughtful individuals can examine the same information, acknowledge the same facts, and still interpret them differently because their experiences, expectations, values, and emotional histories shape how they see the world. This does not necessarily mean that truth is relative. It means human perception is limited. We never approach reality as perfectly detached observers. We bring ourselves into every question we ask. That realization should inspire humility rather than arrogance. It reminds us that confidence and certainty are not always the same thing. Someone may speak with tremendous confidence while quietly suppressing unresolved doubts. Another may openly acknowledge uncertainty while having spent years carefully reflecting on the same questions. Outward appearances rarely reveal the full story. Perhaps that is why some of the wisest people throughout history have spoken about the importance of intellectual humility. Humility does not require abandoning conviction. It requires recognizing that every human mind has limits. That recognition can transform difficult conversations. Instead of trying to defeat another person, we begin trying to understand why reasonable people sometimes reach different conclusions. Curiosity replaces hostility. Listening becomes more valuable than scoring points. Questions become opportunities rather than threats. This shift does not remove disagreement. It changes the spirit in which disagreement occurs. The discussion becomes less about protecting pride and more about pursuing understanding. Ironically, this can strengthen conviction rather than weaken it, because beliefs that survive honest examination often become more thoughtful, more compassionate, and more resilient. At the same time, honest examination sometimes changes people in unexpected ways. Some discover renewed confidence in their faith after wrestling with difficult questions. Others reshape long-held assumptions without abandoning the values that matter most to them. Still others remain uncertain, learning that uncertainty itself need not be an enemy. Each path reflects a different response to the same human condition. The real challenge is not deciding what everyone else should believe. It is deciding how we ourselves will respond when certainty no longer feels effortless. Will we shut the conversation down because discomfort appears? Will we assume that difficult questions automatically threaten what is meaningful? Or will we recognize that the search for understanding has always involved moments where easy answers give way to deeper reflection? There is one more realization waiting beneath all of this, and it may be the most unsettling of all. The question that seems to be about belief may actually reveal something far more personal. It may expose how each of us responds when our need for certainty collides with our desire for truth. That conflict is rarely visible from the outside, but almost everyone has experienced it in one form or another. Understanding why that conflict feels so powerful leads to an even deeper insight, one that reaches beyond religion and into the very nature of what it means to be human. The closer you look at this tension, the more you begin to realize that the most revealing question was never directed at one particular religion. It was directed at every human being who has ever built a sense of identity around a story that gives life meaning. Whether that story comes from faith, philosophy, science, family tradition, personal experience, or cultural values, there eventually comes a moment when reality refuses to fit neatly inside the framework we expected. That moment is uncomfortable because it forces two powerful desires into conflict. One is the desire to remain consistent with the beliefs that have guided us for years. The other is the desire to remain honest about what we genuinely experience, observe, and wonder. Neither desire is inherently wrong. In fact, both are deeply human. The difficulty begins when we believe we must completely sacrifice one in order to preserve the other. Some people become so committed to certainty that curiosity slowly disappears. Others become so committed to questioning that they lose sight of the reasons certain beliefs became meaningful in the first place. Wisdom may exist somewhere between those extremes. It may begin with recognizing that asking difficult questions does not automatically destroy conviction, just as holding convictions does not automatically eliminate curiosity. Throughout history, there have been thoughtful believers who embraced difficult questions without abandoning their faith, just as there have been thoughtful skeptics who continued questioning without pretending to possess every answer. Their examples remind us that intellectual honesty is not owned by any one worldview. It is a discipline that asks us to examine ourselves as carefully as we examine the ideas of others. That is often far more difficult than winning an argument, because it requires admitting that our own motivations are not always as objective as we imagine. Every person carries emotional investments into conversations about meaning. We all have hopes we do not want to lose, fears we would rather not confront, relationships we do not want to damage, and memories that continue shaping the way we interpret the world. Recognizing those influences does not invalidate our beliefs. It simply makes us more aware of the complexity behind them. That awareness can create a surprising kind of freedom. Instead of feeling compelled to defend every answer immediately, we become more willing to listen, reflect, and continue learning. Ironically, that posture often leads to conversations that are deeper and more respectful than those driven by the need to win. Perhaps the question that seems impossible to answer is not impossible because the evidence is insufficient, but because the human heart longs for certainty in areas where complete certainty may never be available. Questions about purpose, suffering, morality, consciousness, and ultimate reality have occupied humanity for thousands of years. Brilliant minds have reached different conclusions while engaging the same mysteries. That alone should inspire humility. It reminds us that sincere disagreement does not necessarily indicate bad faith or intellectual failure. Sometimes it reflects the genuine difficulty of the questions themselves. This realization changes the purpose of the conversation. Instead of searching for a final statement that permanently settles every doubt, we begin searching for the kind of character that can live honestly while continuing to seek understanding. That pursuit requires courage because uncertainty can feel lonely, yet it also creates space for empathy. Once you recognize how difficult these questions are for yourself, it becomes easier to extend patience toward others who are wrestling with them as well. Suddenly, the person across from you is no longer an opponent to defeat. They become another human being, attempting to make sense of existence with the same limited perspective that every one of us possesses. That shift may be more valuable than any individual conclusion because it transforms the conversation itself. It allows people with different convictions to challenge one another thoughtfully, without assuming that disagreement requires disrespect. It encourages us to separate ideas from personal worth. It reminds us that dignity does not depend on everyone reaching identical conclusions. Before leaving this conversation, consider one final possibility. The question that seemed directed toward Christians, skeptics, or any particular group may actually belong to all of us. What do we do when certainty and curiosity collide? Do we become defensive, or do we become reflective? Do we dismiss uncomfortable questions before hearing them fully, or do we examine them with enough patience to discover what they might teach us about ourselves? Those answers may shape not only what we believe, but also the kind of people we become. Whatever conclusions you ultimately reach about faith, doubt, philosophy, or the nature of reality, perhaps the most important outcome is not that you think exactly like someone else. It is that you arrive at your convictions through honesty rather than fear, humility rather than pride, and genuine reflection rather than habit. If this discussion challenged one of your assumptions, whether it strengthened your convictions or led you to reconsider them, share your perspective below. The most meaningful conversations are rarely the ones where everyone agrees. They are the ones where people remain willing to think carefully, listen generously, and continue asking sincere questions even when the answers are more complex than they first imagined.